right, good morning. This is Bonnie McFarland. I'd like to welcome you to our second state and federal directors meeting for 2021 school year. The slides, just so you know in advance, the slides and the recording are available on our website. And if you check in the chat, you'll find a link to those slides. And the recording won't be there yet, but the recording will be there after a little bit after we're done. You will be hearing from all of our program office staff today in this order. Amy Tomomatsu will be starting it off, and then Jeannie Keith is going to be following up on the budget overview, Rachel Garcia after that, Evan Bartelheim and Adrian Balcazar. So they're all here virtually, and they are also here to support you. So we've been hearing from some of you with questions, and those questions have helped drive the agenda for today. So let's take a look at that agenda. And as you'll see, as always, no surprise to you, it's a full agenda, and probably no surprise because you've been dealing with a lot of issues and changes that have been going on, and we're going to touch on some of those today. So we have some important updates and also a few reminders for you on some programs. So we're going to take a look at where we are. Learning continuity plans most districts are finishing those up, but we just want to review where we are with those next steps. Also, we just had a release of the budget overview for parents and the templates for that. So we're going to give you sort of a preview of that, and we'll be spending more time on that at later meetings. Going to have some updates on school plans and also school site council and various advisory committees and how you work with that in this virtual environment. We're going to address Title I and ranking and serving requirements. We're going to look and update on the CARES Act. As always, that seems to be an ongoing topic, and equitable services, and then just some updates on low performing schools grants. Finally, we're going to take a look at SB 98, some changes there based on that law relative to data and the dashboard. And then finally, federal program monitoring. As always, we'll be having an update on that from Adrian. Throughout today's presentations, please put your questions in the chat. A lot of these issues are evolving, and we want to get you as accurate responses as possible. So in most cases, we'll be responding to you in a follow-up with a Q&A within the next couple days. So put your questions in there. And again, we do appreciate your questions because they do drive our work and show us what your needs are. And so please send those in. Also, if you see answers in there, if they're not our answers, you can go with them, but we can't verify anything that we don't have. We'll be sending you something out. Okay, so we're going to start off with Amy Tomomatsu, and she's going to give you an update on where we are with the learning continuity and attendance plan. Amy?
Yes, thank you, Bonnie. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the learning continuity and attendance plan and our next steps there. Next slide. Districts and charter schools are in the process of adopting their learning continuity and attendance plan. So we're starting today with these slides to support your next steps. Education Code 43509 lays out the requirements and timelines for the learning continuity plan. And so we acknowledge the relatively short turnaround for this plan that you've all had to plan for and develop your drafts and get these adopted, all while you are simultaneously preparing for the needs of the new school year. So we definitely want to acknowledge that. So thank you for all your hard work and your teams. Governing boards of school districts and charters will adopt the learning continuity plan by September 30th, 2020. That's coming right up next week. And so prior to the adoption of the board adoption of the plan, you held a public hearing, and then then you'll be adopting that at a board meeting subsequently, not on the same day, but after. And then within 5 days of your board adoption date, school districts and charter schools will submit the plan to LACO through the LACO ELCAP system. Charter schools, you will also be submitting your plan to your chartering authority. If LACO is your chartering authority, then you'll take care of both of those in one step. So before we go on to the next couple slides, though, we wanted to share that we did inquire with CDE about the consequences or any repercussions of a late board adoption date. That has been a question that we've heard around the state. And so, and that would be what would happen if you took that plan past the September 30th deadline. And some of those questions kind of came about because of the fires that have been happening in the state. And so CDE did indicate that they're strongly encouraging LEAs to adopt the learning continuity plan by September 30th deadline. They anticipate that the CDE and districts and LEAs will be audited on learning loss mitigation funds by the U.S. Department of Education and the California State Auditor. And they believe that failure to adopt the learning continuity plan by that September 30th deadline could possibly be viewed as a program compliance issue, which may require CDE to invoice LEAs that have not met program compliance requirements tied to those funds. But as for the extension for possibly LEAs affected by fires, they did say they were seeking out information and possibility of that, but as of this date, they had not yet secured any extensions. Next slide. So let's take a walk through the steps to submit the learning continuity plan on the LACO ELCAP system. This is the same system that was previously used to submit the written report to the community. So you may be familiar with this system. Step one, you will be logging into the ELCAP with your same username and password. If you don't yet have an account, then you would be clicking on register. Otherwise, click on login. Once you're logged in step two, you'll click on the learning continuity plan in the left sidebar there. And then step three, you will click on the orange button that reads Add Learning Continuity Plan. Next slide. Step four, you'll be entering the required fields. The plan title will not appear on the document. It's just really for your reference. And the date of your board adoption, LEA type and name, contact person name, email, and phone. In step five, which is in that purple section at the bottom, you'll click on Choose File. Make sure you've saved your plan as a PDF file, and then you'll locate that file and select it from your computer. Step six, once you select the PDF file of your plan, and this is a very important step, you'll be clicking on the green cloud button to upload the file to the system. You'll see if you're successful with uploading that using that green cloud button, you'll see the name of your file in that box. And once the upload is complete, then you'll move to step 7 where you can click submit. Without the green cloud button being hit, if you click submit before it's uploaded, it actually will fail to upload your plan. Next slide, please. So once your plan is submitted, what's next? As a county office, we will read and review plans for school districts. And while the county office does not have authority to approve or disapprove the plan, we are to review plans to ensure that all components of the prompts and instructions and requirements of SB 98 are met. If there are any recommendations for amendments, a school district will receive those in writing by October 30th, 2020. So this review and recommendation process only applies to school districts and not for charters as per Ed Code 43509C. From the date that the district receives the letter, the formal letter, which would be no later than October 30th, the district has 15 days to take the recommendations to a public meeting of the governing board for consideration. This means that the latest date of the board meeting you would be holding would be November 15th. So for example, if you received a letter from us on October 30th, your board date could be no later than November 15th, which would be 15 days later. Or wait, there's 31 days in October. So November 14th. While the slide says, that's right, Halloween. While the slide says there's no option for formal written clarification prior to the final recommendations, your coordinator will be in touch with you prior to sending that letter to make sure you're aware of any recommendations we'll be providing. Now, if you are planning to have, so it's really going to become important to know when your board date will be so that we can time this correctly for you. So the school district and your assigned LCAP coordinator, one of the 5 of us, will be working with you to determine the optimal timing for the receipt of your letter. Especially for those of you who may only have 1 board meeting per month, we'll be discussing individual cases with you. So now statute does not define the manner in which the recommendations are brought to the board. So this could be, you know, some of you will be considering whether it would be a consent item, information item, or action item. CDE in their FAQs had recommended against consent items in the adoption process of their learning continuity plan, stating that they saw this as inconsistent with the intent of transparency and stakeholder engagement. EC 43509C states that the governing board of a school district shall consider the recommendations submitted by the county superintendent of schools in a public meeting within 15 days of receiving the recommendations. So it simply says they shall consider the recommendations. It doesn't really tell us what type of item that needs to be on your board agenda. Lastly, the Ed Code provides no process for the county office to follow up after we send that letter. The process for any subsequent revisions that you make on that plan will be a local decision. Next slide, please. So our team has been conducting pre-reviews on many district plans, and we have also sent a couple follow-up emails to our LCAP contacts with common areas of feedback that we've been providing. And we wanted to kind of share those again here with a few additional points to provide some clarification. The first area is also probably one of the most important areas to review, which is the increased and improved services. In the plan, LEAs are asked to identify actions that are contributing to increased or improved services for English learners, foster youth, and/or low-income students. I will be referring to these 3 student groups collectively as UDP, which is unduplicated pupil counts. If you mark yes to indicate that the action is contributing, what does it mean? Or what should it not mean? So we're going to start with what it does not mean. Actions should not be marked yes when the action meets the needs of all students in response to COVID-19. In other words, when you have an action such as those related to PPE, and PPE is provided for the safety needs of all students because of COVID, this would not be considered a contributing action. Next, because the plan is intended to describe the actions LEAs are implementing, particularly in response to COVID, plans should contain actions that are intended to support all students, which would be marked no, and actions marked yes, which would be those actions contributing to increased or improved services. So what I'm saying is we would not expect to see a plan in which every action in the plan is marked yes, because you would also need to have actions that support all students. So it would be both yes and no actions. Lastly, if the action is described as supporting students with disabilities and/or low-performing students, even when also serving UDP students, the action cannot be marked as contributing. An action is contributing when it is intentionally designed to first meet the needs of English learners, foster youth, and/or low-income students. So if it's stating that it is an action serving students with disabilities, while they are a high needs student, this action is not a contributing action by definition. So then what does marking yes contributing mean? It means that the action is increasing or improving services for English learners, foster youth, and/or low-income students as compared to the services being provided to all students. And the action is addressing the identified needs, conditions, or circumstances of those students. The action could be limited, meaning that would be actions limited to serve only one of those student groups. For example, an action that would be providing support to EL students, Or the action could be wide, meaning district-wide or school-wide, which is an action that would be designed to meet the needs of English learners, foster youth, or low-income students that might serve other non-UDP students with similar needs. But these wide actions will require additional descriptions, which we will see on the next slide. So the next slide. Next, as we look at the increased improved services section in the template, let's review the difference between the two prompts. So there's two prompts, there's a prompt 1 and a prompt 2. Prompt 1 is for all the actions in the learning continuity plan that are contributing and wide actions. And we say wide actions because they might be district-wide, LEA-wide, or they might be like school-wide at certain grade spans, but all those schools, all your high schools or your intermediate schools or specific schools. So for those actions that are contributing and wide, for these actions, the response needs to address all requirements for principally directed and effective. The response should explain how the LEA first considered the needs, conditions, and circumstances in the development of the action, and how the action is based on those considerations, and how the LEA expects that action will support those needs effectively. A response that describes what those actions are without first explaining what the needs were or the student or student groups it intends to address is not sufficient. So it's not a place where we just further describe what the action is, but needs to really connect to the student needs. Also, in addition, if the CD is clarified that if the district is below 55% or less than 40% UDP, the response should also address how those actions that you're selecting for wide implementation are the most effective use of the funds. And this is really not unlike what you've done previously in the LCAP, which carries those same requirements. In prompt 2, the response will demonstrate how the LEA's contributing actions are expected to result in the required proportional increase or improvement in services for unduplicated pupils as compared to the services the LEA provides to all students. So here, as a reminder, improving services is a growth in quality, increasing services is a growth in quantity, and the LEA shall provide evidence of that growth by at least the percentage related to the increase in funds as reflected in the supplemental and concentration grant funds received by the LEA. These would include actions in the learning continuity plan. If you think about how you already described your wide actions in the learning continuity plan in prompt 1, what you didn't describe there though was your targeted limited actions. So in prompt 2, you would see include evidence of how those contribute towards the required percentage, as well as possibly other actions that you might have outside of the learning continuity plan. So in reading the prompt, you will see in the learning continuity plan or other plans. Next slide, please. So we have found a few additional areas where we're giving some common feedback, and usually we're looking at responses that may not fully address all the components of the prompt. And so those are related to time value of student work, specific information about the plan for the full curriculum and instructional resources used during distance learning, and the procedures for tiered re-engagement and how that outreach is happening. For stakeholder engagement, we have provided feedback regarding the need to present to the Parent Advisory Committee and the English Learner Parent Advisory Committee at separate meetings, and how the superintendent provided a written response. And lastly, a couple final notes to ensure that the plan is understandable to stakeholders. Spelling out any acronyms or defining educational terms would be helpful. And also, actions in those tables, the action tables, should describe who is providing what for whom. General labels or short titles that do not provide stakeholders with an understanding of what's happening in the action tend to be challenging for understanding. So we're asking, just reminding people that the actions should describe who is providing what for whom. Next slide, please. This is kind of a recent development that we wanted to bring to your attention as a result of the recent governor's signing of Senate Bill 820. And this is on the topic related to implementation of distance learning and the technology needed for that. SB 820 updated Education Code 60010's definition of instructional materials. They deleted the provision that excluded electronic equipment from the definition of technology-based materials, and instead specified that technology-based materials also includes the electronic equipment required to make use of those materials by pupils and teachers as a learning resource, including, but not limited to, laptop computers and devices that provide internet access. And a few days ago, CDE updated the COVID-19 FAQ on the Williams Sufficiency and Instructional Materials website. And that question number 5 specifically references Ed Code 43503B, which talks about the need for this equipment to be able to provide distance learning. So we just wanted to kind of put this on your radar. We are seeking clarification on the implications of SB 820 and what that could mean for us. But this is just a slide as a kind of a mental placeholder for now. And we'll be moving on next to the budget overview for parents.
Thanks, Amy. Good morning, everyone. This is Jeannie. I'm going to provide an update on some revisions to the budget overview for parents. So let's take a look at the next slide. And building on the requirements from SB 98, which, as you remember, decoupled the budget overview for parents from the LCAP for the 2020-21 school year, and tied the requirement for the budget overview to be adopted and submitted with the first interim report in December. In addition to that, SB 820, recently signed by the governor, added the requirement for the budget overview parents template to be aligned to the learning continuity plan and to address funding provided to LEAs to address the plan in response to the pandemic. As such, the revenue and budgeted expenditures referenced in the 2020-21 budget overview for parents are tied to the LEA's first interim report, its learning continuity plan, and the 2019-20 LCAP. SB 820 added this subsection G to Ed Code 43509, and this required the superintendent to make specific updates to the template and instructions for the budget overview by September 15th. And so that was done, and the revised template and instructions are now available on the CDE website. We're going to take a look at each of the sections and the related new requirements. Next slide, please. Per SB 820, the templates and the instructions in the revised budget overview for parents include the requirements for the 2021 budget overview to include the specific amount of federal funds allocated to the LEA under the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. Okay, we've come to know these funds as the CARES funds. And SB 820 required that the budget overview for parents include the total budgeted expenditures identified in the learning continuity and attendance plan, and the total budgeted expenditures that contribute to increasing or improving services for unduplicated pupils in the learning continuity and attendance plan. Let's take a look at the next slide. And here you can see where the changes required have been made to the data input screen that's used in the Budget Overview for Parents Excel workbook. This is the same workbook that the Budget Overview for Parents has used previously, but now we can see reflected the new requirements outlined in SB 820. Keep in mind, these changes only apply to the Budget Overview for Parents that's going to be adopted this December, in that they reflect revisions to LCAP requirements for this year and the related inclusion of the Learning Continuity Plan. Okay, this is unique for this year in response to the pandemic. We're going to take a look at each section next. Next slide, please. So for section 1, addressing projected revenue. This section continues to address projected revenue for the current school year. What's added here is the inclusion of the CARES Act funds in addition to the other funds the LEA receives. Previously, the budget overview included federal funds, but didn't include CARES Act funds because we didn't have those. And in the new budget overview for parents, the CARES Act funds must be reported separately from other specific federal funds the LEA receives. In section 1, let's go on to the next slide. There continues to be a required narrative for all LEAs. Here, all LEAs explain for their stakeholders any of their general fund budget expenditures that are not included in the Learning Continuity Plan. Previously, this response explained budget not included in the LCAP. And so this narrative response continues and is required for all stakeholders. Next slide, please. In section 2, this section continues to address budgeted expenditures for the current school year, but now it addresses expenditures included in the Learning Continuity Plan, as well as budgeted expenditures that are increasing or improving services for low-income English learners and foster youth that are identified in the Learning Continuity Plan. Next slide, please. This slide also requires a conditional response, as in the previous section 2 for the budget overview for parents. And so a response will be required when the amount of the LCFF supplemental and concentration grant apportionment is less than the amount of budgeted expenditures to increase or improve services for unduplicated students that the LEA has included in the Learning Continuity Plan. This narrative response should make clear to stakeholders how the proportional increase in LCFF funding is being used in the current year to increase or improve services for UDPs if the full apportionment for the current year is not identified in the Learning Continuity Plan. Next slide, please. And section 3 continues to require a review of the 2019 expenditures budgeted in the LCAP for increased or improved services for unduplicated students, and the LCAP being the Local Control and Accountability Plan. However, while the review required is the same, it's obvious the circumstances and timing for the review of this information are nuanced. So now, instead of reporting estimated actuals, as the LEAs have done through the annual update process, LEAs now need to report their actual expenditures. And with this, the reporting of funding is not connected to the reporting of what occurred using those funds previously provided through an annual update process, because that has not occurred at this time. So it's a slightly different context. It's not reporting what you estimate to have spent, it's reporting actuals, and it is being done before the LEA completes the annual update. Next section, please. Conditional response for this section is triggered like it was in the past, when the total budgeted expenditures in the LCAP for 1920 that were identified to increase or improve services for unduplicated pupils is more than the actual expenditures reported in this section. In that situation where less funds were used by the LEA to implement contributing actions budgeted in their LCAP, the LEA needs to describe how the difference impacted the actions and services and the overall increased or improved services they provided for ELs, low income, and foster youth in the 1920 school year. Next slide, please. For the completion of the budget overview for parents, the Excel format remains the same, where the tabs in the LCAP workbook collect specific information from the LEA, and then that information is used to populate the pre-formatted display. That pre-formatted display appears in tab 5. Additionally, the instructions have been revised to address the new requirements that I've shared that are included in the template. And also, CDE this time has posted a separate PDF of the instructions, so that can be more useful for LEAs as they're developing their budget overview for parents. And CDE's Tuesday to this week addressed the new requirement and included a demonstration of how to navigate the Excel workbook. And they indicated they will be posting that, but I haven't seen that posting yet. All right, next slide. To conclude this section, I wanted to provide an update on posting requirements, and you can see the three plans listed on the screen. Each of these plans is required to be prominently posted on the homepage of the LEA website. You'll note that with the budget overview for parents, this year this document needs to be posted on the same homepage as the learning continuity plan, but it's not as a cover to the learning continuity plan. So it's posted as a separate item. And that's it for the update on the budget overview for parents. I'm going to turn it over now to Rachel.
Thank you, Jeannie. Good morning, everyone. In this section, we just wanted to share a few reminders regarding school plans, as well as a few updates for charter schools and single school districts. Next slide, please. So school plans are not required under ESSA for Title I targeted assistance schools. However, an LEA may choose to require a school plan for its targeted assistance schools. School plans are required for Title I school-wide programs and schools identified for comprehensive support and improvement, targeted support and improvement, and additional targeted support and improvement. Under ESSA, there are specific plan requirements for school-wide programs, as well as specific requirements for CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools. And per Education Code 64001, the school plan must be reviewed and annually updated by the School Site Council including proposed expenditures. Next slide, please. So Education Code 64001J allows charter schools and single school districts to use the LCAP as its school plan if it meets federal school planning requirements, stakeholder engagement requirements for the LCAP, and is adopted in a public hearing. However, this is not an option for the 2020-21 school year since there is not an LCAP this year, and the Learning Continuity Plan may not serve as the SPSA. So for the 2020-21 school year, charter schools and single school districts operating a Title I school-wide program or identified as CSI, TSI, or ATSI must complete a school plan. An important update for charter schools and single school districts is that SB 820 was recently signed, and this requires charter schools and single school districts to use the stakeholder engagement process for the Learning Continuity Plan to meet the stakeholder engagement requirements for the adoption of their 2021 SPSA. So this means that charter schools and single school districts are not required to establish a school site council for the development and approval of their SPSA for the 2020-21 school year. CDE has clarified that if a charter school or single school district has already developed and approved their school plan with their school site council, they don't have to redo this process using the stakeholder engagement process for the Learning Continuity Plan. Next slide, please. This slide highlights some of the key requirements under ESSA for Title I school-wide programs. So a school operating a school-wide program must conduct a comprehensive needs assessment of the entire school based on the academic achievement of all students, but particularly the needs of students who are most at risk of not meeting state standards. Now, there is no required template or document to use for the comprehensive needs assessment. However, the school must also document how it conducted the needs assessment, the results it obtained, and conclusions drawn from these results. Another requirement of a school-wide program is that a school must develop a comprehensive plan that includes descriptions of the strategies it will implement to address the school's needs that were identified in the comprehensive needs assessment. And the strategies or interventions must be evidence-based. An annual evaluation must also be completed to determine whether the plan has been effective in increasing student achievement, and the results of the annual evaluation should also be used to revise the plan to ensure continuous improvement of students. Next slide, please. Education Code 64001 also describes requirements for the SPSA, including the development process and the content to be included in the plan. And these requirements are in alignment with what's required for school plans under ESSA. In the development process, EdCode also requires a comprehensive needs assessment and the identification of a process for evaluating and monitoring the plan. The components that must be included in the plan are goals, evidence-based strategies or actions, and proposed expenditures, including the identification of resource inequities. Next slide, please. So just to state again, the school plan must include goals, actions, services, and proposed expenditures for activities supported with Title I funds allocated to the school. These goals, actions, services, and proposed expenditures must also be tied to the needs identified through the comprehensive needs assessment. It's also important to note that if there are any centralized services provided by the district from school site allocations, these services must also be approved by the school site council and included in the school plan because it's coming from site funds. And something new that we recently heard from the CDE is that District Title I reservations should also be included in school plans, since these reservations are for services at school sites. CDE fiscal monitoring staff indicated that this is something they would be reviewing through the FPM process and would expect to see these reservations aligned to SPSA goals. Unlike centralized services, district reservations should not be included in the total school budget. The total school budget must reflect the amount allocated to the school through the cont app. Next slide, please. There are also specific school plan requirements for CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools per ESSA, as previously noted. So the plan must be informed by all state indicators, be based on a school level needs assessment, include evidence-based interventions, and identify resource inequities. And the requirements listed apply to CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools, with the exception of the school level needs assessment, which only applies to CSI schools. Next slide, please. This is a chart that we've shared many times in various meetings, and it highlights key state and federal requirements for school plans with regards to who is responsible for the development of the plan, when the plan should be reviewed and updated, and what components must be included in the plan. But from the chart, you can also see the alignment of state and federal plan requirements, such as the requirement that the plan include evidence-based strategies and interventions, which is required under Ed Code and also required under ESSA for school-wide programs and schools identified for improvement. Next slide, please. So just as a reminder, school site council and advisory committee meetings are still required during this time of COVID-19 and school closures. As a result of Executive Orders N2920 and N5620, public meetings such as school site council, ELAC, and DELAC meetings.
Yeah, I have the HP at the house.
Yeah, so I don't work with that. I'd be touching stuff.
Sorry. So these meetings may be conducted telephonically or virtually, provided the LEA follows the requirements specified in the executive orders, including providing parents with advance notice of the meeting time, agenda, and teleconferencing information. Next slide, please. So here are just a few things to remember when planning for these virtual meetings. School site councils and advisory committees must still adhere to the Green Act requirements. So it's important to ensure that the meeting time, agenda, and virtual meeting link is sent to all families and staff at least 72 hours prior to the meeting. The information must also be translated into the required languages, and clear instructions should be provided on how to call into the meeting and provide comments if video is not accessible. Translation needs for the meeting is also something that should be considered. It will also be important to ensure that there is a quorum for the meeting, especially if there are any action items on the agenda. Schools could consider making personal phone calls to school site council or advisory committee members to ensure that a quorum is met and that members understand how to access the virtual meeting. Schools and districts should also be sure to maintain documentation of any advisory committee meetings held. In addition to meeting agendas and minutes, documentation that verifies meetings and attendees should be maintained. This might include the recorded audio-video file of the meeting, and in lieu of a sign-in sheet, recording the participants' names from a verbal or visual roll call in the meeting minutes, taking a screenshot or a printout of the participant list, or even a combination of these items. And if the committee is taking action on an agenda item, this could be documented through the chat a poll, or a visual and verbal vote that is also documented in the meeting minutes. Next slide, please. So here we just wanted to provide you with the latest information we have regarding the 2020-21 CSI prompts. And at our previous state and federal meeting, we mentioned that the CDE was working on a process and timeline for approval of the CSI prompts for the 2020-21 school year. The CDE now has a web page for the 2021 CSI prompts, which includes this chart with some important dates. We've included a link to this web page at the bottom of the slide. Based on the dates posted, it looks like the 2020-21 CSI prompts must be submitted to county offices by October 31st, 2020 for review and approval. And the CDE will be hosting a webinar next week on Tuesday, September 29th at 10 a.m. to walk through the requirements for completing and submitting the CSI prompts. A link has not yet been provided by the CDE for this webinar, but we will share the link once we receive it. And that concludes my section. So I will now turn it over to Bonnie for a Title I update.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, we first wanted to just provide an update and some reminders about Title I allocations and some of the associated requirements with Title I funding. So let's take a look at the next slide. Right, as we mentioned last time we met, Title I entitlements are posted on the California Department of Education website. You'll notice here it says Parts A and D. You'll find the two of them are posted together. For school districts, you're going to be looking at Title I Part A entitlement. Part D is for delinquent programs only, and that's primarily county office programs. If you go to look at your allocation and you don't see anything posted in the amount that is allocated, check and see if the columns that indicate whether your CON app is submitted and your addendum is completed. Those two columns need to indicate that those two items are submitted before CDE can put out an entitlement for you. If you want to know how much that you're eligible for, if you go to the very last column, you'll see the amount that the LEA is eligible for. However, you want to look at the beginning part to see is everything clear for you to get those funds. So just make sure, you might want to double check that. Okay. You'll also find other entitlements are posted here for your other ESSA programs. So all of those are available to you. Now for Title I, unlike the other programs, the funds have to be allocated to schools based on specific federal ranking and serving procedures. And you'll notice there a link to the California Department of Education website, and that link provides guidance as to how school allocations should be done and what the federal requirements are. So that's a very helpful link. Now, the funds have to be allocated because schools, particularly operating as school-wide programs, have to annually develop and approve school plans reflecting their current budget and current goals and actions related to that budget. And CD has clarified that in order to spend funds, schools need to have a current approved plan. So those funds, as Rachel shared, you have to have all the requirements for school-wide programs. Those need to be in a school plan, so schools need to have those dollar amounts to start to have that planning done. So let's take a look at ranking and serving. Okay, ranking and serving needs to be done at the beginning of the school year. Although it's not reported until the winter consolidated application, it must be done at the beginning of the year so schools know how much funding is available and they can develop a plan based on those funds. We find some districts, new directors sometimes don't realize they have to rank schools until they're submitting their consolidated application in February. Then they run into all sorts of problems about their schools, what was happening that year. So you can't wait. That needs to be done now. So to rank your schools, you first have to start with all schools above 75% poverty. All those schools must be served first. And then you may serve, and this is new under SS, schools that are over 50% poverty who are high schools. So you can move your high schools up in ranking, but that's a district option, not required. 75% poverty schools must be served. After that, all remaining schools must be ranked by poverty, and you have an option of ranking them district-wide, or you can rank them by grade span. Any schools with over 35% poverty who are at or above the district poverty average are eligible and may be served. And you'll notice that says may be served because not all eligible schools must be served. It just means they're eligible. So how do you decide which schools are served? Well, schools should only be funded if the amount of funds available is adequate to provide a program of sufficient size, scope, and quality to have a likelihood of success. Title I is about putting money in high poverty schools to serve students who are academically at risk. It is not meant to just sprinkle a little bit of money to every school because then you can't have a viable program. So your guide should be, when you start ranking schools, where are you going to cut that? And you need to cut that even if some schools are eligible. They shouldn't be funded if the amount of funds is going to limit them and not allow them to provide a program that has a likelihood of success. The link I provided you on the California Department of Education website will give you a lot more detail on the specifics of ranking and serving, but I suggest you go there and do that right away. Next, we're going to look at just another reminder about Title I requirements and allowable costs. We had the federal flexibility waivers, that was last spring, and just a reminder, they impacted essentially two things for Title I. Title I was given the flexibility if you exceed your 15% maximum carryover for 2019-20 funds. So that's the year that just ended. So you should have your carryover balance. If that exceeds 15%, typically you would, and if you've had a waiver in the last 2 years, you wouldn't be eligible. Once every 3 years. You'll still need to request that waiver, and it's through the February CONAP, the winter submission. It'll be an after the fact waiver, but CDE is able to approve them. We anticipate those waivers will be approved. The other thing the waivers did was allow any LEAs with remaining funds from 2018-19 to extend the period during which they can spend those funds. They were due to expire this month, September 30th, 2020, but the waiver extended that for an additional year. So you have an additional year to use those funds. What the waiver did not do is change any of the program requirements or any of the requirements for allowability of costs. So some people think, oh, we had a waiver that the program's now been changed. The program has not been changed. The requirements have not been changed. Only the timelines for spending those funds have been changed. So just wanted to clarify that. All right, let's move on to the topic that we've been talking about for a long time, which we continue to have changes in. And that's the equitable services under the CARES Act. So again, there's been some legal action that provides us some more clarity and perhaps some more challenges. So let's take a look at those. Okay, so there have been 3 recent lawsuits, and all 3 of those lawsuits rejected the U.S. Department of Education's interim rule restricting the use of Title I funds for public schools if districts chose to use low-income data to determine the equitable share, okay? Just a reminder to kind of go back as to how we got here. First of all, CARES Act indicated that funds were to be subject to the equitable services in the same manner as Title I. That's what the law said. Then the U.S. Department issued guidance saying the equitable share should be determined based on total enrollment. At that time, several states said they disagreed with that and indicated that they would not follow the guidance. Subsequent to that, the U.S. Department of Education issued an interim final rule, which is the first step in developing regulations. And in that, they indicated districts could use low-income numbers. However, they put restrictions on public school use of funds if they did. Litigation then followed that. So recent lawsuits have rejected that interim rule. So let's take a look at what that means for you in the next slide. Okay, the CDE FAQs have been updated periodically as things have moved along, and this is what they say now. They now reflect the language of the CARES Act, that if an LEA receives ESSER or GEAR funds, it must provide related equitable services to students in the same manner as provided in Section 1117 under Title I. Okay? Again, this applies to GEAR and ESSER funds. And just a reminder, in the next slide is that your learning loss mitigations combine several funding sources. Right? Within that, you have two federal sources, GEAR and Coronavirus Relief Funds, and one state program, general funds. So you see those acronyms, you see GEAR, CR, and GF. Those are the three funds that are all included in learning loss mitigation. Within those learning loss mitigation funds, only the GEAR funds are subject to the equitable services requirement. So you need to pull those funds out when you're doing your calculations. All right, the next slide is from the CDE website. And again, their FAQs were updated, and they noted that in June, the interim LEAs should provide equitable services in the same manner as in 1117. They do note at the bottom, this is a dynamic legal situation, and we are not sure whether or not the department is going to, what actions they might take subsequent to this. But this is where we are now. Next slide. Okay. Subsequent to that, there's been more recent action. Just this month, the most recent decision in the case of the NAACP versus DeVos found that the department's final rule conflicts with the language of the statute and is thus void. It includes a reminder that the department cannot make law through regulations. This is something we've discussed previously, that there's a difference between a statute, regulations, and guidance. That's why initially when guidance came out, some states said that they would not follow the guidance because guidance is not legally binding, okay? So then the US Department moved forward with regulations, which have a greater force than guidance and must be followed. So many of you moved ahead following the guidance. However, the regulations cannot conflict with the statute, which is what was found in this case, that the regulations conflicted, and that's why they were nullified. The result of all this has been a delay in services for students. And I really want to compliment all of you out there. Districts have worked hard to do your best to try and understand this through this chaotic situation, to move forward with consultation in an effort to begin services as soon as possible in the midst of the chaos created by the department's actions. So I really appreciate the efforts you've made and the frustration you've had in trying to get services to students. So let's take a look at what this means and what's changed. Next slide, okay. First, as much as we hope this puts an end to this issue, again, and the department may respond, they may appeal the decision, we don't know, but this is where we are now. So the only place there was language indicating the equitable share was based on the total number of low-income students was in the regulations, okay? And the regulations indicated that it was low-income students from private schools in the LEA. So this is why districts move forward with consulting with private schools within the LEA. Now that the regulations have been nullified, the only language we can lean on is that of the law. And the CARES Act says that the services should be provided in the manner of 1117. What does that mean? It means we have to follow the Title I requirements for determining equitable share. Title I uses residence and poverty for that identification. Those of you who have been working with these programs for a long time know that. So low-income students residing in Title I school attendance areas generate funding for Title I. So that means that CARES Act fund should be, the equitable services amount should be determined in the same, using the same formula to determine that proportional share. All right. Okay, next slide. So how does that work? And just a reminder, it's the LEA. This is from Title I. This is how the Title I formula, because we've had some questions on this. Well, where do I get the numbers? The numbers are students age 5 through 17 from low-income families who attend private schools in your Title I school attendance area. And how you get those numbers, ideally it should be the same measure used by your public school. If that's not available, district can use surveys, and many districts do use surveys. The third option, often referred to as proportionality, means you have to look at each school and the percentage of low-income students in that school and apply that. Or an equated measure might be something that a private school might include to identify low-income students that's comparable to what the district uses, which is like free and reduced lunch. So that may be a scholarship program or something that they have that they use to identify low-income students that's comparable to what you're using. So those are how you do it. Then the next step, based on those numbers, is to look at the number of eligible low-income students in the district, those in the private schools that are participating. You come up with a total amount, and you're going to divide that by the ESSER and the GEAR amounts to come up with a per pupil amount. So then you can apply that per pupil amount to determine the equitable share. Again, the change is, before it was districts in your district boundaries. Now we're looking at the Title I formula. So let's take a look at how you should proceed or might proceed. Next slide. So what do we do now? Well, if you haven't already consulted with your private schools, and I believe most of you have, but if you haven't, you need to consult with them to determine what low-income information will be collected. Okay. Are they using the same measure, free and reduced lunch data? That's great. If not, you're going to look at those other three options and determine how to identify low-income students. Then the next thing you'll have to do is request addresses of students who are identified as low income to determine if they reside in Title I school attendance areas. And then we're suggesting you contact those private schools outside your district boundaries that you're aware of who have students from your Title I school attendance areas. So if in the past you've had students who typically attend schools outside the district boundaries, then it would be reasonable to contact those schools to see if they have students who would be eligible. If that's the case, then you're going to need to contact the district of residence and talk with them to ensure that they're not duplicating funding, to make sure they're using that same procedure to identify students. So again, challenging and unfortunate that it's, this is what CDE, what we've gotten from them. They're saying contact your attorneys if you're unsure of how to proceed, but this is based on what the law says. This appears to be what they're suggesting. Next, we'll look at services. So we had a question before about those restrictions. So nothing in the CARES Act restricts which public services, public schools can receive services with GEAR or ESSER funds. It only says that equitable services be provided in the same manner. So it doesn't address anything about public schools. Section 117 only governs equitable services. It has nothing to do with public schools or school level allocation. Only the interim rules put that restriction on the use of it only in Title I schools. So under CARES, there are no restrictions on which schools you could use those funds in. All right. And it also follows that given the use of funds are not limited only to low-income students, although one of the allowable uses is to support low-income students. So you're not following exactly the student. All right, next. Public control of funds. We've had some questions about this. Section 1805 of the CARES Act actually specifically includes the same requirement as is in ESSA about public control of funds. So it makes it very clear that the same requirements that are in ESSA apply to the CARES funds when it comes to private schools. What does that mean? It means that the district has to control the funds for services and assistance provided to the non-public school, and that any materials, equipment, and property belong to the school district and are under their control. So although ESSER and GEAR funds may be used for expenses back to March 13th, and so we know that they had that as allowable in the law, but districts can't reimburse private schools for costs that they incurred. Right, because of the public control of funds requirement, can only pay for services directly to vendors or contractors. So hopefully we can move forward on that one. All right, we just wanted to update you on a couple things relative to learning loss mitigation funds that took place. Again, Senate Bill 820 was just signed the end of last week, over the weekend, and so it is now law. And let's see, there were a few things that have some implications for those funds. Next slide. Okay, so first, it extended the timeline for the expenditure of general funds to June 30th, 2021. That was one of those funding sources that had that December deadline. These are state, so the legislature had the authority to make that change. They put language in allowing extension of the federal funds if the federal government makes that change, but they have not to this time. So the coronavirus relief funds, which are the biggest chunk, still have that December timeline. But the general funds that are included, if you look at the learning loss mitigation, it's one of the funds. Those have been extended. It also now allows for use in California state preschool programs and adult education programs, which was previously not allowed. And then to the allowable uses, you recall there were 4. If you look on the CDE website, you'll find there are 5 allowable uses now. And the 5th one expanded the use for health and safety concerns, including things as health testing, PPE, supplies to sanitize and clean facilities, school buses, and other related needs. So significantly expanded the use of funds for learning loss mitigation. Just a reminder on learning loss mitigation, all the federal funds that LEAs have agreed, and they must maintain receipts and records for expenditures for at least 5 years, and was mentioned earlier, these programs will be subject to state and federal audits. And then one more funding update sort of and program update, and that's something you may have forgotten about. It was a few years ago that you were allocated funds through the Low Performing Students Block Grant. And we just wanted to give you a reminder that those funds will be expiring next year, November 1st. Those funds have to be spent. They can only be spent through the I'm sorry, the report is due on November 1st, but the funds have to be expended during the 2021 fiscal year. So if you have any remaining funds, first of all, make sure those get spent this year. But secondly, check out the requirements for the report. You're going to have the report due on November 1st, and that report's going to require you to address implementation of the plan and strategies that were used, and whether they increase the academic performance of the students who were to be served. Remember, these were funds that were to address the needs of low-performing groups that were not included in the unduplicated pupil groups. And initially, the law said that there would be a plan and that this might be included in your LCAP as to how you were using those funds. We didn't see a lot of that in LCAP, so I'm not sure maybe that you've had them in other plans, but there should be a plan, and you need to address how did you implement that plan? What strategies did you use, and did they work for those students? So that's coming up next November. So that might be something you might want to have on your radar to be thinking about. All right, I think that is it for those updates. And now we have another SB 98, and Evan's going to walk you through some of the data implications from that. Evan?
Thanks, Bonnie. Good morning, everyone. Collective sigh there. It's a big chunk to go through. Just a reminder, all your questions, we will get to your questions in our follow-up FAQ if you posted something to the chat. We like to give a nice thorough response to everyone. So there have been some changes to data collection due to SB 98. Just going to go over those briefly. Next slide, please. So as a result of the changes to SB 98, the data that LEAs certify as part of the CalPADS 2021 submissions continue to be critically important for several reasons. And while many of you know that the ADA from 1920 is being used in the calculation of the principal apportionment, it's important to note that the data that LEAs certify in their Fall 1 certification, which is represented in the CalPADS report 1.17, it's your count of free and reduced meals, English learners, and foster youth, that will be used to calculate the supplemental and concentration grant apportionment. So there is some 2021 data being used for your principal apportionments. And literally hot off the presses, this came in by email during the presentation. There will be a CalPADS flash coming out in the next day or so that's going to notify districts that the free and reduced lunch record in CalPADS, if it contains a start date before or equal to December 30th, will be included in your count for unduplicated pupils. So that's an extension of the timeline for your UDP count, and the direct certification results into January will count as well. So there's some additional extension for the Fall 1, but just be aware of that. But most importantly, it's critical that someone's reviewing that data in the CalPADS report to make sure it's most accurate to capture all your unduplicated pupils for your LCFF supplemental concentration. Additionally, the unduplicated count, or in addition to the unduplicated pupil count, CalPADS data will be used to calculate things like class size penalties. So again, important to use. For any newly operational charter schools in 2021, their funding is going to be based on the enrollment as of Census Day, which is October 7th year, and that's reduced by the statewide average rate of absence from fiscal year. So I don't know if we have any brand new charter schools, but any that are just operating in 2021 have a slightly different calculation. Next slide, please. So here's just the timeline for the dashboard, but notably, LEAs that approve their Fall 1 submission by the certification deadline will receive a private preview of their unduplicated pupil count. They can be used for planning purposes, and that will feed into the calculation of the LCFF supplemental concentration grant funding. LEAs that fail to approve their Fall 1 submission by the certification deadline will not receive this preview, and they'll receive a letter stating that the LEA or SELPA failed to approve the submission by the deadline. So don't want to have that happen. Data certified will be used for some preliminary accountability reporting, so there's some additional uses for besides just LCFF planning. Next slide, please. So this is just a reminder that although LEAs will not be required to collect attendance for ADA purposes in 2021, they're still required to submit student attendance for the purposes of accountability through CalPADS. While no changes will be made to the current CalPADS chronic absenteeism collection, guidance will be provided to LEAs regarding how to report distance learning attendance and absence through the existing CalPADS file. Also, just a reminder that the 2021 dashboard will be based on performance data on the December 2019 dashboard. That'll be your status, and the data that LEAs submit and certify in 2021, primarily through your end of year submissions. Those will be used to calculate the indicators on the 2021 dashboard, when we'll again see some things calculated. Next slide, please. So this was just a graphic from a dashboard update that went out from the CDE, but notably the data from the 1920 end of year submissions, those are just submitted. They're not being used to calculate any indicators on the 2020 dashboard, because we're not going to have a dashboard that includes performance data. The 2020 dashboard is going to include only LEA and school details and student enrollment data. It will also include a link to DataQuest, which is where the CDE is required to publish the data to meet federal reporting requirements. Notably, that data that's posted there, it's going to be limited, but it can also be used for school and district needs assessments for the LCAP or for your SPSAs. Next slide, please. So finally, because Senate Bill 98 established that the CDE won't be publishing a dashboard in December 2020 based on performance data on the state and local indicators, LEAs are not required to report local indicator data. So there was time there where there was some confusion about that, but just to confirm, no local indicators to be reported this fall to the local governing board, and no need to complete the self-reflection tools for the December 2020 dashboard as was originally expected. However, the local indicator standards, which were adopted by the state board in January of 2020, remain unchanged, and they should be considered, must be considered when developing your LCAP for next year. So the 21-22 LCAP through the 23-24 three-year LCAP. So you should be starting to gather the data or collect data related to parent and family engagement, broad access to course of study, all these things that will be reported. So just because we have a slight hiatus here between the 2020 dashboard, don't forget to continue collecting your data for that process. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Adrian to bring us home with a FPM update.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there. Man, this has been so much information and so much happening right now, and we're still dealing with the pandemic. So, you know, thanks for hanging in there. Yes, I'd like to wrap it up with the federal program monitoring, and you know, it doesn't go away. Accountability does not go away. So let's talk a little bit more about the federal program monitoring. So as you know, the purpose of the federal program monitoring review, and I'm going to talk specifically about the review itself. If you're selected for a review, the purpose of it is to verify that your federal programs are meeting the legal requirements. Because remember, as you sign those assurances, you're verifying that you are going to comply with all the legal requirements. And so each program does have its own program instrument. And so the FPM process is going to address not only the compliance, but also the program effectiveness. And so what it's looking at is, you know, how you're going to meet all those legal requirements. So here's some samples of some non-compliant, some items that were non-compliant. First of all, there were in the state of California 128 schools that were reviewed. And so of those, these were the top 5 that were identified as the most frequently non-compliant items. So starting with CE10, and there were 39 districts that were identified as LEA dispersed funds consistent with CARS. That was a finding. The CE2, school parent and family engagement policy, having all those components and having it annually revised. CE18, the school site evaluation of program effectiveness. And CE5, the school site council composition, that there was elections by peers, that there's parity, and that it was done, in a timely manner. And CE13, LEA administrative charges and time accounting. As you know, anyone funded through federal programs must have duty statements, time accounting reports, and it has to be allowable, consistent to the federal program. The next one is the other programs that were identified. So we have the English Learner. These are the top 5. They also reviewed 128 school districts and charters throughout California. These are the top 5. We have EL14, EL1 of English Learner Advisory Committees, EL3, EL Identification and Assessment. We have EL Reclassification, and EL15, the Access to Standard Instructional Programs. These are down below here on the slide. We see the top ones for each of these programs. So we see UCP1, Policies and Procedures, Fiscal Monitoring, number 1, the timekeeping requirements, Education Equity. We see number 1, the prohibition of discrimination, harassment, intimidation, and bullying. And for extended learning programs, number 9, it's the funding for direct services to pupils. And then we also have PE6, which is the pupil exemption. So these are some of the top things that have been found out of compliance. So in reflection of your own programs that you have at your district, again, you want to make sure that you are addressing all the legal requirements. So let's take a look at during the pandemic and what that looks like for districts this year that have been identified to be reviewed for the SPM update. Here we have if you look at the last column, that's for this school year, 2021. It is called telemonitoring. And so we look at the highlighted areas and we see that the use of the CMT is still being utilized in the telemonitoring school year. We also have an entrance meeting that will be done during the beginning of your FPM review, and this is done through the Zoom. This will be a Zoom meeting. Then we also see that there will be interviews of the LEA staff, and this too will be done through Zoom. And then we see that the observation of instructional settings are not highlighted because we have no student observations that will be taking place. Lastly, we see that there is daily debriefings, and this will be done in the telemonitoring year, and this is done through the CMT. Generally by 4 p.m. each day, there is a summary at the end of the day that you check the CMT and you can see the debriefing for that day. You can see here there is no official exit meeting. However, if districts would like a additional Zoom meeting to go over any particular clarification, it's not a time of negotiating any findings, but you can ask to have that meeting to clarify any findings and how to resolve those findings, and that would be through Zoom. So some key points to consider and actually to address during this COVID pandemic time, and that is the understanding more than ever is that the program staff and the fiscal staff need to work together to understand that not only in fiscal monitoring, the fiscal compliance also involves the program. And so what are those policies and procedures, and how is the program actually being implemented? So the two are very intertwined in terms of moving forward with implementing your program, and then also too with your FPM review. And so for those that are not being reviewed, the same interaction still applies. So we just want to make sure that both your fiscal department and program people are working together for compliance. So specifically for this year, you may want to look at how are you maintaining your internal controls. If you're not in session right now, how is paperwork going through the process that are set forth in your policies and procedures? In time accounting, did your duty statements change? Did your monitoring and your daily activity logs, what do those look like? Are they reflecting what is actually occurring today under the pandemic? Also, the allowable costs. So we do know that the waiver allowed for the carryover, but it didn't change what's allowable, what's reasonable, what's necessary to implement your program. So again, maintaining that you have to make sure that it's an allowable cost. And also too, the supplement, not supplant, needs to be maintained in terms of it needs to supplement your core program. So those did not change. So in looking at how to update your policies and procedure, how update are your policies and procedures? So you might want to take another look at when's the last time that you have updated your policies and procedures? And is there some provision in there that addresses the extenuating circumstances that we're under today? So what is your allowability procedures? What about your conflict of interest, your procurement procedures, your equipment management procedures, your travel policy? And as we talked before, your time and effort policies and procedures. Has anything changed, or when's the last time you have updated these procedures? And we are addressing this because it definitely came up in fiscal monitoring. We find that the findings that are happening in the FPM review are really being noted by the fiscal monitoring reviewers. And they see that they want to make sure that if you say you have a policy, then they need to see the evidence that your district is following the procedures that you have set forth, and as well as your school plans. And so if you're saying that this is how you're spending your Title I money, then the plans are very important, because the fiscal monitoring wants to make sure, as well as all of the CE and any other programs that are utilizing the school plan, they want to make sure that you're following what you say and that the paper trail matches. So again, it's so important to be up to date on all these aspects. So whether you have been selected for federal program monitoring review or not, accountability does not go away. And so you want to make sure that you have all the assurances, you understand what's needed to implement the program legally, and that you are following it, and you have your evidence that shows that you are, so that when you are, and if you are selected for a federal program monitoring review, it's a matter of just gathering the evidence that's set forth in the instrument and having that discussion and sharing what great things that you're doing. So again, accountability does not go away whether you're selected or not. So it's important that you follow and you know what's required. So that concludes our today's webinar workshop. And so we leave you with the Zoom chat open for any questions. And we will, in a few days or so, we will be providing the answers to all your chat questions. So feel free to do that. You also have our SFP at laco.edu. You have that also to send any questions, as well as to any of us coordinators, and of course to Bonnie. We all love responding and looking up, because you definitely help guide our work as well. Here are the links at the bottom for the accountability federal programs, as well as the LCAP. So again, we want to thank you for joining us. And I think we just made it right in the nick of time at 11:29. So thank you again, and we'll see you next month.